Have you ever seen like one of those massive forces, those things that look totally unshakable, and then suddenly they like change direction?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's what caught our eye today. It's the story of this big Democratic law firm, Paul Weiss,
Uh-huh.
and they ended up, kind of surprisingly, making a deal with former President Trump.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
we've got this really in-depth article that lays it all out, this whole surprising situation.
Okay.
It basically dives into how a firm that was, so aligned with one side of the political spectrum could make a deal with, well, someone who represents a completely different viewpoint.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a fascinating turn of events.
And that's really what we're going to try to understand in this deep dive
Mhm.
for you, the listener. Like, what actually made this happen? What were the motivations behind it all? And what could this mean for, the legal world and even beyond that?
It's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. So let's unpack this whole thing. Where should we begin?
Well, I think we have to start by establishing the initial context. Brad Karp, the chairman of Paul Weiss, he has this well-documented history of being a pretty vocal critic of President Trump, especially during his first term.
Yeah, and the article really hits on that. Karp wasn't just like sitting back and watching things unfold. He was actively involved, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about someone who has a long track record of like fundraising for Democratic candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually took a pretty leading role in trying to rally major law firms to like band together and oppose some of the Trump administration's policies.
Right. He was trying to create a unified front against what he saw as problematic.
Exactly. And a key example of that is the whole issue of separating migrant children at the border. That's where Karp was really pushing for like a serious legal challenge.
Precisely. And what makes this even more important is that his opposition wasn't just happening behind closed doors. He made public statements, underscoring what he saw as this fundamental obligation for lawyers to defend the rule of law.
So he was really going up against Trump pretty publicly.
He was. It was a public stance against many of Trump's actions.
And this wasn't like a one-time thing, right? This wasn't just during Trump's first term. Even as recently as 2023, Karp hosted a Lawyers for Biden fundraiser.
Right. He remained actively opposed to Trump.
Plus, we know that one of his partners was actually involved in helping Kamala Harris get ready for those potential debates with Trump. So it paints this clear picture of a firm that was like deeply embedded in Democratic politics and, seemingly very much opposed to Trump's whole agenda.
Totally. Which makes the subsequent events, all the more striking.
Yeah. Okay, so then what happened?
Well, the article goes on to detail how President Trump ended up issuing this executive order, and it specifically targeted Paul Weiss.
Okay, so what was this, like a slap on the wrist? What are we talking about?
No, it's way more serious than that.
Yeah.
The article describes it as a potential existential threat to the firm.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and they also point out that the legality of the order itself was pretty questionable.
So it wasn't even like legally sound, but it still posed this massive threat.
Exactly. It highlights the kind of pressure they were under.
Yeah.
Even if it was legally dubious, which means it likely would have been challenged in court, such an order could still, really disrupt the firm's operations big time.
Right.
Like, it could affect their ability to do business with the government and potentially even impact their contracts with existing clients.
Okay, so they were in a really tight spot. So what did they do?
Well, initially, it seems like Karp's instinct was to fight back.
Makes sense.
The article mentions that he actually started talking with another major law firm, Quinn Emanuel,
Yeah.
and they were discussing launching this, unified bipartisan legal challenge to the executive order.
Okay, so they were going to present a united front.
Exactly.
So what changed?
That's the fascinating part. Instead of going ahead with that legal challenge, the article says that Karp decided to go directly to the Oval Office to try and negotiate a deal.
Wow. Okay. So it was a huge shift away from confrontation.
It was
Yeah.
a real change, of course.
So what exactly was in this deal?
The core of it, from what's been reported, was a pledge from Paul Weiss to provide a whopping $40 million in pro bono legal services to initiatives that were, supported by former President Trump.
Okay.
And this included an anti-Semitism task force, which was supposed to be set up within the Justice Department, as well as, quote, other mutually agreed projects.
Okay, just to be clear for our listeners, pro bono, that means they're providing these legal services for free, right?
That's right, free of charge.
So we're talking about a huge commitment from Paul Weiss, $40 million in free legal work.
It is.
But the article points out some pretty significant discrepancies between how this agreement was presented publicly and what was communicated internally within the firm.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting because the White House came out and claimed that Paul Weiss had agreed to stop using DEI policies.
Okay, DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those policies, aimed at promoting diversity and fairness in hiring and, operational practices within the firm.
Right.
But the internal statement that Karp shared with his own firm made absolutely no mention of any agreement like that.
Okay, so that's a pretty big difference in messaging.
It is. You have Trump publicly saying one thing and then the internal communication completely omitting it.
Yeah, and then there's the issue with Mark Pomerantz.
Right, the former partner of Paul Weiss. Trump asserted that Karp had admitted that Pomerantz, who, by the way, has a history of pushing for criminal charges against Trump, Trump said that Karp acknowledged Pomerantz engaged in, quote, wrongdoing. Again, this wasn't mentioned at all in Karp's internal communication to his firm, according to the article.
Okay, so from the get-go, we have these totally different accounts of what the deal actually involved. It makes you wonder what really pushed Karp to go for this settlement. Like, what was his main motivation?
Well, the article seems to strongly suggest that it all comes down to protecting the firm's financial interests. And there's substantial.
Yeah. How substantial are we talking?
Last year, their revenue was reportedly $2.63 billion. Billion. And they represent some really major clients like ExxonMobil and Apollo Global Management. So an executive order like the one Trump issued could have put billions of dollars in potential revenue at risk and made them, much less appealing to clients who need government approvals.
So it sounds like it was a calculated risk.
Yeah, it seems like they weighed the potential financial blowback against their, stated values and Karp's own public stance against Trump.
So essentially it was money versus principles.
That seems to be the central issue.
And then, of course, there's the bigger question of what kind of message this sends.
Exactly. The article really explores that. By seemingly giving in to this kind of pressure, Paul Weiss may have, even unintentionally, made other law firms more vulnerable to similar tactics.
You're saying it sets a precedent.
It could. It could send a signal that using executive power in this way can be effective.
And did the White House do anything to discourage that idea?
Not really. A White House official actually suggested that Trump planned to keep targeting other law firms with these executive orders.
Wow, okay. So this wasn't just a one-off.
It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
It really reinforces Trump's narrative that these firms, quote, did bad things and are now, quote, wanting to make deals. Now, whether that's an accurate way to look at it, well, that's up for debate. But it clearly shows his approach.
Yeah, it does. So how did the legal world react to this whole thing?
The article says that a lot of people were, pretty shaken up by the news. They were worried about what kind of precedent it might set.
So they're thinking, if it happened to Paul Weiss, it could happen to us.
Exactly. And there were divisions even within Paul Weiss itself. Reportedly, the corporate partners who, are more focused on the firm's financial well-being were mostly on board with the deal.
Okay.
But some of the firm's litigators, who might be more inclined to take legal action, they weren't so happy about it.
So even internally, there was disagreement.
There was. And it wasn't just inside the firm. The article mentions a lot of condemnation from lawyers outside of Paul Weiss, especially from some prominent critics of Trump. Like, there's a quote from George Conway, and he calls it the most disgraceful action by a major law firm in my lifetime.
Wow.
It's a pretty strong statement.
It is. And how did clients react?
It was a mixed bag. Some were probably relieved that the firm avoided a major crisis. But the article also mentions that some senior lawyers at big financial institutions expressed their concerns, even hinting that they might reconsider working with Paul Weiss.
So it definitely had some reputational damage.
It seems so.
So let's zoom out a little bit and look at the broader picture.
That's right.
This wasn't the first time Trump targeted a law firm.
No, it wasn't. The article mentions previous executive orders directed at Covington and Burling and Perkins Coie.
And what did those firms have to do with Trump?
Well, they had been connected to investigations or legal challenges involving Trump or his associates in various ways.
Okay. So this was a pattern for him.
It appears so.
But there was this hope, right, that Paul Weiss would follow the lead of Perkins Coie, who actually chose to fight their executive order in court.
Yeah, that's right. And a federal judge actually temporarily blocked that order against Perkins Coie, which raised serious concerns about a president using his power to punish individuals and companies.
Right.
And this ruling gave people in the legal world hope that the courts would, put a stop to these kinds of actions.
But then Trump issued the order against Paul Weiss, and it was almost identical.
Exactly. It shows how determined he was to use this tactic, even after facing a legal setback.
And the article links this directly to the work Mark F. Pomerantz had done against Trump in the past.
When he was at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. It suggests that even past associations can make a firm a target.
And these executive orders had the potential to be really damaging, right?
Absolutely. We're talking about the possibility of being barred from doing business with the government and even affecting their clients' government contracts.
That kind of pressure would be hard to ignore.
For sure. And that brings us to the behind-the-scenes talks that led to the agreement.
Okay, let's dive into that.
The article gives us some interesting details about how it all went down.
Like what?
Well, initially, it seems like Karp was serious about that joint legal challenge with Quinn Emanuel.
Okay, so he was ready to fight.
Yeah, and the article mentions his conversations with William Burke, who's their co-managing partner.
Okay.
And William Burke is a pretty important figure here because he's one of the few lawyers at a major firm who represents the Trump organization.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and he's also advised some of Trump's nominees. So you can imagine Paul Weiss and Quinn Emanuel joining forces against the executive order. That would have been a huge statement.
Right. It would have sent a strong message.
It would have. But then things shifted towards trying to work out a settlement.
Okay.
And it seems that Robert Kraft, who owns the New England Patriots and, is known to be friendly with Trump, played a role by reaching out to Trump directly.
Interesting. So they were looking for a way out of a legal battle.
Yeah, and Burke was also talking to his contacts in the White House, letting them know that Karp was open to a deal. And during these conversations, a key concern emerged from the White House side.
What was it?
They felt that major law firms were becoming increasingly hesitant to represent conservative clients, especially after January 6th.
So they saw it as a trend.
They did. And that's why part of the proposed agreement involved Paul Weiss potentially making a public statement affirming their commitment to representing clients regardless of their political views.
So they were trying to address that perception head on.
Yeah. And then came the direct communication between Trump and Karp, which eventually led to that 3-hour meeting at the Oval Office.
Okay.
And Steve Witkoff, a Trump advisor, was also there.
So was it like a tense meeting?
Actually, the article suggests that it was pretty amicable. Both sides felt like they could reach an agreement.
But, I mean, Karp must have been feeling a lot of pressure.
Oh, absolutely. And the article mentions that some of the lawyers within his firm, those who were getting ready for a legal battle, they were worried about delaying things and potentially missing the chance for a quick legal win.
So he had to balance those competing interests.
He did. And there were ongoing discussions about the exact wording of the agreement.
And it's interesting because Karp had actually supported Perkins Coie when they challenged their executive order in court.
Right.
So his strategy definitely changed in this case.
It did. And the article mentions some personal context for Karp, too. He'd recently had a heart attack and was gradually getting back to work.
Right.
And in the email he sent to the firm explaining the decision, he referred to a 1963 statement of principles, which suggests he was trying to frame this deal within the firm's historical values.
It's fascinating how all these personal and professional pressures come into play in a situation like this.
Absolutely.
But we can't forget about those key differences between what Trump said publicly about the deal and what Karp shared internally.
Yeah, those conflicting accounts about the DEI policies and the mention of Mark Pomerantz are really at the heart of this whole thing.
And Mark Pomerantz himself denied any wrongdoing.
He did. So we're left with these competing narratives.
So taking a step back, looking at the big picture here, what's the main takeaway for you?
I think it shows that even a prominent Democratic law firm, one that was initially very opposed to Trump, can end up making significant concessions when faced with a direct threat to their financial well-being.
It's a powerful example of how political power and economic interest can clash.
It is. And it makes you think about the pressures on institutions and individuals with different political views. How might these dynamics affect the legal world and society as a whole? It's definitely something worth pondering.
It is. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. We hope you found this exploration enlightening, and as always, keep those critical thinking caps on. Until next time.
See you then.